The wind howled across the barren hills, a lonely cry that echoed the emptiness in Malachi Brooks' heart. He'd lived a lifetime of solitude on the unforgiving frontier, trying to bury the ghosts of his past. But one evening, as the sun dipped low and his cattle grazed near the creek, he heard a sound that would change everything, a soft, desperate whimper, barely audible over the rush of water. It was the sound of a girl, a dying girl, alone in the wilderness. And despite every warning his survival instinct screamed, Malachi couldn't turn his back on her. In the wilds of New Mexico, kindness was a dangerous thing, especially when it came to the Comanche. But something about her frightened eyes, her wounded body, and the weight of her fragile life stirred memories too painful to ignore. Malachi had once lost a daughter, and now he would risk everything to save another. Malachi Brooks had long since given up the hope of ever finding peace. He had carved out his life in the dry hills of New Mexico, the harsh land offering little more than hard work and solitude. Years had passed since he'd lost his wife and daughter to a fever, and with them, any notion of future. The only thing that kept him going was the rhythm of ranch life, the cows, the horses, and the endless, unforgiving horizon. But for all his attempts to bury the past, the pain of loss had a way of finding him, no matter how far he rode from it. It was late in the evening when he heard it, the faint sound that made his heart stop, like a whisper carried by the wind. He was on his usual route, checking his herd by the creek, when a sound pierced the air. A soft, desperate whimper, so quiet it almost got lost in the rustle of the water. Malachi paused, his hand instinctively going to the rifle slung over his shoulder. A wolf? Maybe a coyote? But then again, it wasn't quite like any sound he'd heard before. He listened closely, straining his ears against the wind, and there it was again, louder this time, unmistakably human. Malachi's chest tightened. For a man who had lived alone for years, a human sound in this barren place was a rarity. His instincts told him to leave it alone. He'd been down this road before, helping someone out only to get caught in the crossfire of trouble. A white man saving a Comanche in these parts wasn't just foolish, it was a death sentence. And yet, as much as Malachi's mind screamed to turn around and walk away, something in him refused. Maybe it was the sheer helplessness in the whimper, the desperation of it. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because she reminded him of his own daughter, of the girl who had never grown into the woman she could have been. Malachi had buried Sarah years ago, but her memory still haunted him like a shadow, chasing him through the empty hours of his life. Without thinking, he moved toward the sound. His boots crunched softly over the dry earth, the quiet breaking only by the rush of the creek and his own heartbeat. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting a golden light over the land, but it felt colder as Malachi approached the source of the sound. It wasn't long before he saw her. The girl was slumped behind a cluster of mesquite bushes, her body draped in tattered clothing, the dirt of the land caked over her face. Her breathing was shallow, ragged, and Malachi could see the blood that pooled beneath her, seeping into the earth. A Comanche girl, barely 16, with dark hair matted against her forehead. A bullet wound in her shoulder. She was barely alive. His first instinct was to walk away. It would be the safest thing to do, the smartest thing. Helping a Comanche girl in these times was a fool's game. The local settlers wouldn't care that she was young, that she was dying. They would care only that she was one of the enemy, and in their eyes, that was reason enough to let her die alone. But as Malachi looked down at her, something stopped him. She was so small, so frail, almost childlike. And then, her eyes fluttered open, weak and frightened, staring up at him. There was no hatred in her gaze, no anger. Only fear. Fear of death. Fear of a world that had abandoned her. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The sound of the creek flowed steadily in the background, as if the earth itself were waiting for Malachi's decision. Her eyes seemed to speak without words. She didn't ask for help, didn't beg. But there was something about the look in her eyes, something that reminded Malachi of the look Sarah had given him when she was sick, that same silent plea for help that he hadn't been able to answer. He knelt beside her, hands trembling. The girl's breath was shallow, her body burning with fever. His fingers hovered over the wound, assessing it. The bullet had passed clean through, but it had torn through flesh and muscle, and the infection was already setting in. She needed help. Fast. Easy now, Malachi whispered, even though he knew she couldn't understand him. She flinched as he touched her wound, her body jerking with pain. I ain't gonna hurt you. He was lying, of course. He had no idea what he was doing. He could try to stop the bleeding, try to save her life, but it was risky. It could draw the Comanche right to him. And if they didn't kill him, the settlers would. But when he looked at the girl again, her terrified, pleading eyes, the words his wife had spoken all those years ago echoed in his mind. Always help when you can, Malachi, even if it's the hardest thing you'll ever do. That was the truth of it. He couldn't turn his back. Not again. With a deep breath, he scooped her up gently, cradling her like she was something precious, something worth saving. His arms strained under the weight of her, but he held her close, feeling the life draining from her body with each breath. He carried her the short distance to his cabin, his mind racing. What was he doing? This was madness. The Comanche were ruthless, and they didn't forget. But even as the questions raged in his mind, his feet moved steadily toward the cabin. He couldn't explain it. He didn't want to. There was just something inside him that refused to let her die. When he laid her down on the bed, his hands were shaking. Malachi knew the girl would die without help. But as he set to work, cleaning the wound and trying to keep her alive, he realized that helping her was going to cost him everything. And yet, there was no turning back now. Malachi's hands moved quickly, the sharp sting of whiskey and the coolness of water trying to battle the fever coursing through the girl's body. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his mind on the weight of the decision he'd just made. The girl's life now hung by a thread, one that he was trying his damnedest to hold on to. Her breathing was shallow, but it wasn't as erratic as it had been before. The fever was breaking slowly, and for the first time since he'd found her by the creek, Malachi allowed himself a breath of hope. As he worked, the sun sank lower in the sky, casting the cabin in a long, golden glow. The sounds of the day quieted. The buzz of insects, the distant calls of coyotes, the rush of the creek. But still, Malachi couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. His instincts told him that something was coming, that the calm before the storm was about to break. He was right. After hours of tending to the girl, Malachi stepped outside to check on his horses, wiping his hands on his pants. His mind raced with thoughts of what the girl's presence meant, what kind of danger he had just invited into his life. He'd been content with his solitary existence, believing the world had left him behind. But now he had someone to lose. And in the West, that was as dangerous as it got. As he moved toward the barn, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest sound of hoofbeats in the distance. He froze, his body instinctively going still, every muscle on alert. It was only a few beats, a few distant thuds that could have been mistaken for the rumble of thunder, but the sound seemed too precise, too deliberate to ignore. Malachi's eyes scanned the horizon, the sun now low enough to cast shadows over the distant hills. Then he saw them, a line of warriors on horseback, riding steadily toward his cabin. 50 of them, he counted. 50 riders, moving as one, their war paint gleaming in the dying light. Malachi's stomach dropped. They weren't just riding across the land. They were coming for him. His heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't planned for it. The Comanche had their own ways of dealing with trespassers, and a white man caring for one of their own was nothing short of a death sentence. And it wasn't just about the girl. It was about what they believe, that he'd taken her, that he'd hurt her. Malachi moved quickly back toward the cabin, his mind racing through his options. There were no good ones. No way out that didn't involve bloodshed. The girl's eyes snapped open the moment he entered the cabin. Ayanna. He remembered her name, though he couldn't remember how he'd learned it. Her eyes were wide with terror, the depth of her fear only growing as he reached her side. She tried to sit up, but winced in pain from the wound in her shoulder, her small body trembling. "Easy now," Malachi said softly, putting a hand on her shoulder to gently ease her back down. She was so light, so fragile, and her body was slick with sweat from the fever. He could see the desperation in her eyes. She knew what was coming. "They're coming," she said in broken English, her voice trembling. "My father." Malachi's heart skipped a beat, the realization hitting him like a blow. "They're coming for you, aren't they?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She nodded weakly, her eyes filled with panic. "They think I am captive," she continued, her voice shaky. They want to kill you." Malachi swallowed hard. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, more to himself than to her. The words were hollow, empty. He hadn't meant to save her. Not like this, not knowing it would lead to this kind of trouble. He'd never asked for this. But here it was. The cavalry was coming, and he was trapped in his own cabin with a girl who couldn't stand, couldn't fight, and couldn't help him explain the truth. He moved to the window, peering through the shutters. His heart sank as he saw the line of warriors growing closer, the glint of their weapons flashing in the fading sunlight. They were getting closer by the second, and with each passing moment, the reality of their situation became more and more apparent. Malachi knew what the Comanche thought. They believed their chief's daughter had been taken. He was the one who had saved her life, and to them, that made him a target. The truth didn't matter. No one was going to listen to him. Not with the warriors so close, not with the bloodied girl lying on his bed. There was no escape, no way out, except to face them head-on. He turned to Ayanna, his gaze locking with hers. She was trying to sit up again, her injured shoulder protesting with every movement, but determination was still in her eyes. He could see it. She was ready to fight for her life, even if it meant taking him down with her. "Stay down," he said softly, but firmly, his hand resting on her good shoulder. She looked at him, her brow furrowing in confusion, but Malachi could see the wheels turning in her head. She understood. "You need to stay hidden," Malachi said again. "Don't try to help me. They'll kill us both." But she shook her head, her small hand clutching the pendant around her neck. She looked at him with something like desperation. This girl, barely more than a child, had already lost so much, and now she was about to lose everything again. Malachi didn't know what to say to her. She was right about one thing. She was the only one who could expose the truth. But in a world like theirs, where loyalty ran deep, where bloodshed was the only language most understood, what good would the truth do? A voice rang out from outside, loud and commanding, echoing through the open space of the cabin. Malachi stiffened, his hand instinctively going to his rifle. "Bring her out. We know you have her." The voice boomed, a deep and harsh command in Comanche. It sent a chill through Malachi's bones. His heart raced. "They're not going to leave without her," Malachi said, more to himself than to Ayanna. "And if I don't do something, if I don't explain to them what's happened, they'll come in here and take you." "Take me." Ayanna reached up with her good arm, touching his hand lightly. Her expression was a mixture of fear and determination. She was willing to fight, to face her father's wrath, to risk her life for the truth. But Malachi knew something she didn't. The truth was the most dangerous thing in the West. And now it was the thing that might get them both killed. The sun was sinking lower in the sky as the warriors grew closer, their presence now unmistakably threatening. From Malachi's position at the window, he could see them more clearly, their painted faces set in grim determination, weapons glinting in the fading light. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of dust and impending danger. They were almost here. Malachi's hand tightened around the rifle, the cold metal a reminder of the impossible choice ahead. He turned back to Ayanna, who had somehow managed to sit up, her eyes steady and focused on him. Despite her injuries and the terror surrounding them, she was strong, perhaps stronger than Malachi himself. She had no other choice but to fight, for herself, for the truth, for the lives of the families her father had destroyed. "We can't stay here," Malachi said softly, his voice thick with the weight of what they had to do. "They'll come for us, and if they don't get us here, they'll burn everything in their path." We need to get to the fort. To Fort Davidson. Ayanna nodded slowly, her grip tightening on the small rifle Malachi had handed her earlier. Though she was still pale and trembling from the fever, there was a fire in her eyes that burned brighter than the setting sun. "Ow!" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the pain and the fear that clung to her like a second skin. Malachi turned to the back of the cabin, walking quickly to the far wall. With a steady hand, he pushed aside a small section of wood, revealing a hidden door beneath. It was narrow, almost suffocating, but it was their only chance. The tunnel stretched into the darkness beyond, leading to the ravine behind the cabin. "This will take us out of sight," he said, his voice low and determined. "But once we're out there, it's open country. We'll be exposed, and with those warriors behind us." Ayanna's eyes flickered to the tunnel entrance, a flicker of hesitation in them. She could barely walk, let alone flee through the wilderness with a group of warriors on their tail. But the choice was clear. She could either take her chances with Malachi or face Takakota's wrath. She didn't hesitate long. "I will follow," she said with quiet strength, though her voice trembled slightly. "But if we get caught, we won't," Malachi said firmly, his expression grim. He didn't believe his own words, but there was no time to explain the reality of their situation. The Comanche weren't just a threat. They were their only threat now. They couldn't afford to take the time to think it through, and they couldn't afford to fail. "If we make it to the fort, we'll have a chance. But it has to be now. If we stay, we're dead." He grabbed his rifle, checking the ammunition once more. The rifle felt heavy in his hands, but it was a necessary weight. He had only 6 rounds. Against 50 warriors, that wasn't much of a chance, but it was all he had. With one final glance at the cabin, Malachi turned toward the tunnel. "Stay close to me," he ordered, his voice sharp with the urgency of their situation. Ayanna, despite her trembling, nodded, pushing herself to her feet. Malachi helped her, guiding her carefully through the narrow entrance. Her shoulders screamed in protest, but she kept moving, determined to survive. They moved through the tunnel in silence, their footsteps the only sound breaking the stillness. The air was thick and musty, and the walls felt as if they were closing in around them. Malachi could feel his heart hammering in his chest, the weight of the impending danger pressing in on him with every step. They had no time, no room for error. Once they reached the end of the tunnel, Malachi pushed aside the final piece of wood, revealing the small clearing where he had hidden his horses. It was well concealed, a place that had served him well in the past when Apache raids had made him fear for his life. But today, it felt more like a death trap than a sanctuary. Ayanna stumbled out of the tunnel, her legs unsteady, and Malachi quickly helped her onto one of the horses. He glanced around the small clearing, checking for any sign of pursuit. Nothing. For now, they were safe. But only for now. Malachi mounted the second horse, and as he did, he turned to look at Ayanna. She was already holding the reins, her face set with a determination that reminded him of the old days when he fought to protect his own family, when everything wasn't so broken. "You ready?" he asked, though he knew the answer before she spoke. "I'm ready," Ayanna said, her voice stronger than before, though her hands still shook as she gripped the reins. "We can't stay here. We need to move." Without another word, Malachi spurred his horse forward, and Ayanna followed. The horses moved quickly through the brush, keeping low, trying to avoid being seen from the ridge above. They moved in the direction of the ravine, hoping that the warriors wouldn't know about the hidden tunnel or the path that would take them out of the area. But they didn't have much time. Malachi could hear the sound of hooves behind them, the distant cries of warriors as they pursued. It wasn't long before the first Comanche rider appeared on the horizon. Then another and another. The warriors were closing in on them, spreading out in a wide formation, trying to catch them off guard. "Faster!" Malachi shouted, urging the horses onward. The wind whipped past them as they raced through the open country. The land stretched out in front of them, endless and unforgiving. There was no cover, no place to hide. It was a race against time and against the inevitable confrontation that would come. As they rode, Malachi glanced back to see the Comanche riders gaining ground, their war cries rising in the air like thunder. His heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't dare look back for long. There was no time for hesitation. They were riding toward the fort, towards safety, but the road ahead was perilous, and the warriors behind them weren't giving up. Ayana's voice reached his ears, breathless and filled with fear. "They're catching us. What do we do?" Malachi's grip tightened on the reins. His heart told him to keep pushing forward, to keep fighting. But there was no guarantee. The Comanche were fierce, skilled in battle, and even with the cavalry just ahead, he didn't know if they would make it in time. "We keep riding," he said simply, his voice grim, "and pray we get there alive." The ravine opened up into the vast, empty plains. The wind howled, tugging at their clothes and stinging their faces. The horses' hooves pounded the earth beneath them, a rhythmic beat that matched the rapid thudding of Malachi's heart. He couldn't afford to look back now. The cavalry was their only hope. He urged his horse on, pushing it as fast as it could go, his eyes scanning the horizon ahead for any sign of the blue uniforms. But the sound of war cries grew louder behind them, and soon, Malachi knew, there would be no escaping it. The Comanche were relentless, their pursuit unyielding. They were closing in, spreading out across the plain like a storm that would wash over them. There was nowhere to hide, no place to seek cover. He glanced over at Ayana. She was holding on, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear, but there was no doubt in her spirit. Her jaw was set, her determination unwavering. Despite her wounds, despite the agony she must have been in, she refused to let go. She refused to let herself be a victim. For that, Malachi respected her more than he had ever respected anyone. The cavalry had to be close. They had to be. Malachi's gaze swept over the land ahead, desperate to catch a glimpse of the soldiers, but there was nothing. Just open, unbroken land stretching on for miles. The first of the Comanche riders appeared in the distance, then a second and a third. They were coming for them. Fast. "Stay with me, Anna," Malachi said, his voice tight, his grip tightening on the reins. He could feel the sweat on his palms, the tension in his body. His mind raced. He had one last chance, one desperate chance to survive this. The cavalry had to make it in time. Ayana's voice barely reached him over the pounding hooves and wind, but he heard her clearly enough. "Malachi, I'm scared. Stay with me," he repeated. "Just a little longer. We'll make it." She nodded, but he could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't believe it. He didn't either. The warriors were gaining on them, and soon they would be within striking distance. The sound of hooves behind them grew louder, closer, like a thunderclap before a storm. Malachi's heart seemed to stop, and for a brief moment, time slowed. His mind flashed back to the day he'd buried his wife and daughter in the hills, to the day he'd made his peace with the past and decided to live in isolation. How had it come to this? How had his quiet life, his attempt at redemption, led him into this madness? There was no more time for thinking, no more time for second-guessing. A shout rang out behind them, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle. A bullet whizzed past Malachi's ear, too close for comfort. The warriors were closing in, their war cries rising in intensity. It was now or never. Malachi's eyes darted from side to side, scanning the plain for any sign of the cavalry. He felt the weight of the rifle against his back and knew he had only a few precious moments to make a choice. He couldn't outrun them. He couldn't fight them all. His only hope was to hold off the warriors long enough for the cavalry to arrive. "Hold on, Ayana!" Malachi yelled as he reined his horse sharply to the left, leading them into a narrow ravine just ahead. The horses pounded through the dirt, kicking up clouds of dust behind them. The ravine provided some shelter from the open plains, but it was also a trap. If the Comanche caught up with them here, they would have nowhere to run. "Why are you going this way?" Ayana shouted, her voice strained. "They'll see us. They can't catch us if they can't see us." Malachi shouted back. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. It was their only chance, but it wasn't much of a chance at all. The ravine was narrow, and if the warriors followed them in, they'd be trapped in a box with no way out. But it was too late to turn back. The sound of hooves pounding against the ground grew louder, and Malachi risked a quick glance over his shoulder. A dozen Comanche warriors were on their tail, riding fast and hard. Malachi's heart raced in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They were almost there, almost within range. Ahead of them, the ravine split into two narrower paths. Malachi's mind raced. He had only seconds to decide. The right path led to a dead end. The left, Malachi didn't know where the left path went, but it had to be their only hope. He turned the horses sharply to the left, feeling the weight of Ayana's body shifting behind him as they plunged into the narrowest path. The ground became rougher, the rocks sharp underfoot, but they couldn't slow down. They couldn't afford to. Ayana screamed in pain as the horse jostled over a rock, but she held on. Malachi didn't dare look back. He could hear the warriors behind them, yelling at their horses, urging them on, but they were still a little too far behind. They had a chance, but how long would it last? Malachi, they're coming, Ayana cried. I know, Malachi replied, his voice tight. Hold on, just hold on. Then, just as they reached the bend in the path, Malachi saw it, just barely. A glint of sunlight on metal. A line of blue uniforms, riding in formation, cutting across the plain. Hold on, Malachi shouted again, his voice raw with relief. The cavalry was here. The warriors behind him saw it too. The sight of the cavalry stopped them in their tracks, causing a momentary hesitation. Malachi didn't know how long they would hesitate, but it didn't matter. They were here. The cavalry captain, a man Malachi recognized from his time in the fort, raised his rifle and fired a warning shot. The warriors skidded to a halt. Takakota was in the front, his eyes wild with fury, but for the first time, he didn't move forward. The battle wasn't his to fight anymore. That's enough. The captain's voice rang out, stern and commanding. These two are under our protection now. For a moment, everything stood still. The warriors, still watching from a distance, seemed to reconsider. The cavalry had arrived, and their intervention had turned the tide. The Comanche would have to retreat, at least for now. Malachi slowly guided his horse toward the cavalry formation, feeling Ayana's grip loosen on his back as the danger began to subside. The battle wasn't over, but they had made it. They had made it through the worst of it. Ayana's voice was quieter now, almost calm. We're safe. For now, Malachi said, his voice tired but relieved. The sun was beginning to dip behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows over the plains as the dust settled around them. Malachi felt the weight of his rifle, its familiar cold steel suddenly feeling more like an anchor than a weapon. He had fought and survived countless battles in his past, against the elements, against his own demons, and against the land itself. But today, he felt as though the hardest fight was over. His heart still raced from the chase, but there was a sense of uneasy peace settling in, like the calm before the storm. The cavalry soldiers moved into position, forming a protective ring around Malachi and Ayana. Captain Morrison, who had taken command of the small unit, rode up beside them. He was a tall man with graying hair and sharp eyes, his face hardened by years of frontier service. But there was a gentleness in his gaze as he looked at Ayana. Miss, the captain said, his voice gruff but respectful, you're safe now. We'll get you back to the fort and have a doc look at that wound. Ayana nodded, her eyes still filled with fear, though there was a flicker of gratitude there too. She hadn't spoken much since they had reached the cavalry, but Malachi could see the relief in her body language, the way her shoulders had relaxed, how her grip on the rifle had loosened just enough to ease the pain. Malachi knew the dangers weren't over yet. They had made it out of the immediate threat, but there was still the matter of Takakota and the warriors. They would return. They had to. Takakota had too much to lose, and now the truth about his atrocities was out. Malachi couldn't let his guard down. Not now. Not until they were safely back in the fort. As the cavalry began to lead them toward the fort, Malachi fell into step beside the captain. The wind whipped through the tall grass, and the sounds of the horses' hooves were the only things breaking the silence between them. You're a brave man, Malachi, Captain Morrison said, his voice low, as if he were thinking out loud. Most men would have left her to die. The Comanche, they're not exactly friendly toward white men, especially not after what's happened between us. I didn't save her for the Comanche, Malachi replied quietly, his eyes fixed ahead. I saved her for me. The captain looked at him, an eyebrow raised in silent question. For me and my daughter, Malachi continued, his voice thick with emotion. She would have been her age now. I couldn't let her die alone. The captain said nothing for a long time, just nodded solemnly. The silence between them felt heavy, but there was a shared understanding. The weight of the past was never easy to carry, and sometimes saving a life wasn't about justice or honor. It was about redemption. Malachi had been running from his past for years, hiding in the solitude of the hills, trying to forget. But in that moment, with Ayana's life in his hands, he'd found a way to move forward. Not all the way, not yet, but enough to take another step. As the day faded into dusk, they approached the fort, its sturdy walls a symbol of safety in the midst of a land full of peril. The soldiers rode ahead, and the gates slowly creaked open, the light from within spilling out like a warm embrace. The fort had been a place of refuge for many, a place where men like Malachi could rebuild their lives, or at least try to. But for Ayana, it was just another place of uncertainty. The truth she carried with her could change everything, and Malachi knew the fort's walls would be no protection against that. They were met at the entrance by the fort's doctor, a middle-aged man with a kind face, who immediately took Ayana's arm and began examining her wound. Malachi stepped back, watching as the doctor worked, his hands steady and practiced. She'll make it, the doctor said after a moment, glancing up at Malachi. She's lost some blood, but the wound isn't deep. She's lucky. Luck's got nothing to do with it. Malachi muttered under his breath, but the doctor heard him. You're right, he said, looking over at Malachi with a knowing gaze. But luck or not, you did right by her. You saved her life, and that counts for something. Malachi didn't reply. He couldn't. There was too much he still had to figure out, too much he needed to do. The world he had created for himself in the hills was fading fast, and he wasn't sure what to replace it with. But in that moment, as the sun disappeared behind the hills and the sky darkened into night, there was one thing he knew for sure. He wasn't running anymore. Ayana had saved him as much as he had saved her. Later that night, Malachi stood by the window of the fort's barracks, his arms crossed over his chest, looking out into the night. The moonlight bathed the landscape in a soft, silver glow, but Malachi's mind was far from calm. The future was uncertain, and the threat of Takakota still loomed large. But for now, he had done what he could. He had made his stand, and he had acted with honor. That was enough for the moment. You didn't have to do it, you know. Ayana's voice came from behind him, soft and uncertain. He turned to see her standing in the doorway, her bandaged shoulder propped against the frame. She was pale, her face drawn with exhaustion, but there was strength in her eyes. You could have left me. Let them take me back. You didn't have to risk your life. Malachi looked at her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. You're not a burden, he said finally, his voice low but steady. No one's a burden. Not anymore. Ayana nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. She stepped forward slowly, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. Thank you, she said quietly. Malachi said nothing. He didn't need to. He had done what needed to be done. The night stretched on, quiet and still, but in the distance, Malachi could hear the faintest whisper of something new, something that he hadn't heard in years. It was the sound of a man starting to heal. Malachi didn't expect to survive the ride. The odds were too stacked against him, and he knew the risk. But with each passing second, as he and Ayana raced toward the fort, he found himself growing more desperate. Not for his own life, but for hers. And just maybe for the future of a land that had long since forgotten mercy. The horses' hooves echoed across the dry earth as they galloped through the plains. Behind them, a cloud of dust rose like a rising storm, the warriors following closely, their war cries echoing off the canyon walls. They were gaining ground. The warriors knew these lands better than any white man or Comanche girl could, and they had the determination to match. Malachi urged his horse forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel Ayana's presence behind him, her body swaying with the rhythm of the ride. And though he didn't need to look back to know she was there, he did. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed forward, and she clutched the rifle in her hands with surprising steadiness. The pain from her wound had dulled with the shock of the ride, but Malachi could see the signs of exhaustion creeping in. It wasn't just the fever that threatened to slow her down. It was the terror, the grief, the weight of everything she had witnessed. She had seen things no child should ever see, and yet, here she was still fighting. "Hold on," Malachi called out, his voice hoarse from the dust. "We'll make it. Just keep riding." Ayana nodded, though he wasn't sure if she truly heard him. Her eyes were distant, haunted. They had no choice now but to make it to the fort. It wasn't just the warriors they were running from anymore. It was Takakota's lies. It was the people who had trusted him, the people who would believe his version of the truth because they had no reason to doubt their chief. The soldiers at Fort Davidson needed to hear Ayana's story. They needed to believe her. And if that didn't work, well, Malachi wasn't sure what they would do. He glanced behind him again. The warriors were closer now, their horses thundering against the earth, their weapons raised. The gap was closing quickly. He needed a miracle, but as the sun set lower in the sky and the terrain began to change into the wide, open space of the plains, a glimmer of hope shone on the horizon. "They're getting close," Ayana said through clenched teeth. "They'll be upon us soon." Malachi nodded, pushing his horse even harder. The cavalry, he thought. They had to be nearby. He had seen them earlier that day, riding along the ridge, moving in a straight line like a storm on the horizon. It was their only chance now. If the cavalry could reach them in time, they would be safe. But the chase was on. The riders behind them were relentless, their pursuit steady and unforgiving. Malachi could hear the war cries of the Comanche warriors, but there was another sound beneath it, the pounding of his own heart. His chest was tight, and every breath felt shallow, as though the air itself was working against him. Suddenly, the terrain opened up. The ground stretched flat, and the wind picked up, brushing against his face like an old acquaintance. In the distance, a cloud of dust rose from the horizon. "There!" Malachi shouted, his voice full of renewed hope. "There they are. We're almost there." Ayana's eyes shifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Malachi saw a glimmer of hope in her gaze. The cavalry was close now, only a mile or so away. If they could just make it through this final stretch. But Takakota's warriors were closing in. The next few moments seemed to stretch forever. Malachi's horse pushed forward, galloping harder, faster, with the wind howling in his ears. He looked ahead. He could see the first cavalrymen now, their horses straining under the pressure. And then, as if the world was suddenly standing still, the Comanche warriors surged forward, racing toward them like a tidal wave. Malachi's heart leapt into his throat as the first arrow sailed through the air, missing him by mere inches. He twisted in the saddle, trying to stay focused, trying to keep Ayana calm. "They're coming, Ayana!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "Get ready." She nodded, tightening her grip on her rifle, her face set in grim determination. The world around them was a blur of dust and chaos. The air was thick with the sound of galloping horses, war cries, and the thunder of their own breath. Just as they reached the edge of the open plains, the cavalry finally appeared, thundering down from the ridge with a chorus of rifle shots echoing through the air. Malachi's heart surged. The cavalry was here. Salvation was within reach. But Takakota's warriors were quick, too. They had split their formation, flanking Malachi and Ayana on both sides. The cavalry had arrived just in time, but the battle wasn't over yet. Captain Morrison shouted orders to his men as the cavalry swung into formation, their rifles raised. The Comanche warriors hesitated, seeing that they were now facing well-armed soldiers. The warriors' hesitation didn't last long, however. With a growl of fury, Takakota swung his horse forward, leading the charge against the cavalry. The chaos erupted again, but now it was Malachi and Ayanna who had the protection they needed. With a steady hand, Malachi fired his rifle into the advancing warriors, hitting one square in the chest. The warrior's horse stumbled, and another rider slammed into him from behind. Malachi felt a moment of triumph, but there was no time to celebrate. The battle raged on, the sound of rifle fire and clashing hooves filling the air. Malachi kept fighting, his movements fueled by nothing but raw instinct, fighting for his life and Ayanna's. And then, in the midst of the chaos, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Takakota had broken through the cavalry line and was charging straight for him, his war cries rising above the rest. The battle was far from over. The clash of hooves and the crack of rifle fire continued to ring out across the plains, a symphony of chaos. Malachi's heart raced as Takakota's war cry pierced the air. The Comanche chief was close now, close enough for Malachi to see the fire burning in his eyes, the fury of a man who had long since lost any sense of mercy. He had to stop him. He had to end this, for Ayanna, for the families Takakota had killed, and for the fragile hope that clung to life between them. His rifle was steady in his hands as Takakota bore down on him, like a storm about to break. The warriors had scattered, some taking on the cavalry, others forming a circle around Malachi. But Takakota, with his war paint smeared and his face a mask of rage, charged toward him, his knife drawn and gleaming in the sunlight. "Come on, Malachi," he growled, his voice a low, guttural rasp. "Let's finish this." Malachi's rifle cracked, the shot ringing out louder than anything he'd ever heard before. But Takakota was fast, too fast. He ducked under the bullet, his knife slicing through the air. Malachi's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. The Comanche chief was upon him, and Malachi barely had time to swing his rifle up to block the strike. The two men collided with a force that knocked the breath out of Malachi. His back slammed against the saddle of his horse, the wind knocked from him. Takakota's knife came down like a lightning bolt, but Malachi rolled, narrowly avoiding the deadly blade. He scrambled to his feet, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Everything was in slow motion. The sound of the horses, the crackle of the gunfire, the war cries in the distance. Takakota lunged again, his knife raised high, but Malachi was ready this time. In one swift motion, Malachi drew his second pistol and fired. The shot rang true. Takakota's eyes widened as the bullet struck him in the chest. He staggered backward, disbelief flashing across his face before he fell to the ground, his knife falling from his hand. For a moment, silence hung in the air like a heavy fog. Malachi stood over the fallen chief, chest heaving, his breath ragged. He looked down at Takakota, the man who had murdered so many innocent families, who had manipulated his people into violence, who had lied and killed to cover his own crimes. The war was over, but there was no victory. There was no triumph in this moment, only the bitter taste of truth. Ayanna had ridden up beside him, her face pale, but her eyes steady. She had survived the worst of it, and now it was over. But even as the battle raged around them, Malachi knew that the fight for justice was never truly finished. The cavalry, now victorious, rode up beside them, surrounding the last of the Comanche warriors who had not yet fled. Captain Morrison dismounted, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the fallen Takakota. "Is it done?" the captain asked quietly. Malachi nodded, his voice hoarse. "It's done." Ayanna, still weak but standing tall, handed the pendant to Morrison, her face filled with the weight of everything she had witnessed. "He killed them," she said simply. "The families, the children. He killed them all." Morrison took the pendant, his jaw tightening. The proof was undeniable, and with it, Takakota's reign of terror had ended. He looked at Ayanna, his expression softening just slightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low murmur, "for bringing us the truth." But Ayanna didn't respond. Instead, She looked back at Malachi, her eyes filled with something he hadn't expected. Gratitude, mixed with something deeper, something unspoken. "I didn't know if I could do it," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "But you didn't give up on me. You didn't leave me." Malachi looked down at her, his heart heavy with the weight of his decisions. "I couldn't leave you," he said simply. "You were never alone. Not while I'm here." And as the sun set over the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains, the two of them stood there, side by side. The battle had ended, and justice had been served, but the price had been steep. The truth had been uncovered, but at what cost? The ghosts of the past still lingered, the weight of loss and pain was still there, but there was also something new, something they hadn't expected. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was redemption for men like Malachi. Hope that the world could change, even if only for one person, one act of kindness, one brave choice. As the wind carried dust across the open land, Malachi looked toward the horizon, knowing that his journey wasn't over yet. But for now, they were safe. For now, the fight had ended. In the desert, mercy rides slower than the wind. Malachi whispered, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. But it always comes.